Chapter 5. Departure and Destiny. Ed caught the morning blimp for the capital the following day, as commanded by the Navy Board to appear before them at the capital at 1400 sharp. A ticket had been purchased for him by the Navy Board, and Ed found himself in the first-class cabin, seated next to a thin, frail bureaucrat with pasty white skin, dressed in a much too large greatcoat. "Headed for the capital?" asked the gray-suited gentleman. An odd question, thought Ed, given that this was a direct flight. "Cigars, cigarettes, tipperillos, brandy?" called out the scantily clad stewardess as she shimmied down the aisle. Ed fished out 6 Lindens. "I'll have 2 Uncle Ben's bourbon," he said. It was going to be a long, long flight. The stewardess handed him 2 small bottles and said, "It's free," and then moved on. "Yes," Ed said, finally responding to the gentleman in the adjoining seat. He examined the man more closely. The man was short, balding, and with a gravity-defying comb-over. A few thin strands of blonde hair were wrapped around and around the shining dome, creating the impression of angel hair pasta caught in a Cuisinart gone terribly, terribly wrong. But the most remarkable thing about his flying companion were his hands. He had very long, thin fingers with nearly translucent skin, and to his astonishment Ed counted 12 fingers. Then, to his amazement, there were 12 on the other hand as well. "Allow me to introduce myself," said the bureaucrat. "I'm Philpot Onus." "Pleased to meet you, Philpot," said Ed. "That's Herr Doctor Philpot Onus," replied his cabin mate, handing Ed his card. "Ah, well then, Dr. Onus, I presume," replied Ed, desperately seeking some humor on this cold morning. Ed glanced at the card in his hand. It was larger than the normal business card, and was printed on expensive cardboard of a type that only government officials and escort services could afford. Ed fingered the embossed great seal of Second Life resplendent in the blue hand. In fine copperplate engraving, indicative of the expensive version of Photoshop, Ed read, "Ministry of Antiquities and Dusty Relics. Dr. Philpot Onus, Minister Extraordinaire, Number 15, Avenue of the Beast, Capital, Second Life." "I've never met a minister before," said Ed. "This is really extraordinary," he continued. Dr. Onus chuckled and stared Ed directly in the eye. Ed became very uncomfortable. Dr. Onus said, "Don't worry, I won't bite." Dr. Onus scratched his left ear, which Ed noticed was badly scarred and bleeding. Ed had not been this uncomfortable since that night in Bangladesh when he ate the pigeon curry pie and everyone else stuck with the raw vegetables. "And what brings you to the heart of the ocean?" Dr. Onus asked Ed, seeking to shift the conversation to something more congenial. "Ah," replied Onus, "the recent discoveries, fascinating, truly marvelous," continued Dr. Onus. Ed vaguely remembered something in the Songono Times about the discovery of some archaeological importance, but for the life of him he could not remember the details, except that it had something to do with a crown or some jewels or something. "Undoubtedly you read about the discovery in the Times," said Dr. Onus. "Well," said Ed, as he stalled for time to think of something intelligent to say, "I'm a sea captain, and I've been at sea, so I miss many of the current events, and those not so current as well." "Ah!" Dr. Onus smiled, that smile of an entomologist examining a spider about to be placed in a jar with a bit of ether in a cotton swab at the bottom and the label already prepared, reading "Extinct." "I'm sorry, Dr. Onus," said Ed, pulling his me-comp from his carry-on. "I have some important notes to review and very little time to prepare." Ed then booted the me-comp, waiting for the Baffles computer clown to finish twirling his head and laughing insanely, and then he selected the file labeled Navy Board, Courts-Martial. Ed reviewed the files for about an hour before he noticed that the good doctor was reading them as well. Not the casual glance or the curious peek, but the intense focus of a man who needed to know and didn't care that you knew too. Ed shifted the me-comp a bit to the left, and Dr. Onis immediately followed, his eyes intensely fixed on the heavy text-laden script. Ed coughed. Dr. Onis shifted his gaze to Ed and smiled. "I'm sorry, I seem to have dropped my peanut," said Dr. Onis. Odd, thought Ed. They haven't had peanuts on this flight since Blimp Blau, now part of the Blimp cartel, emerged from Chapter 2 in the first book of this series. Ed decided to put the me-comp away and reached for the power-down lever. Before he could reach the lever, a cold, 12-fingered hand wrapped itself tightly around his hand, very tight, and with a grip far stronger than he thought possible of the bureaucrat. "I wouldn't do that, Dr. Hallard," said Onis in a dry voice edged with coal. Dr. Onis motioned with his head towards his other hand, which now held a blue steel, short-barreled musketoon of Eastern origin hidden beneath his greatcoat. The barrel of said musketoon was pointing directly at Ed's beating heart. "Merde," thought Ed. With lightning-quick reflexes honed in the exotic port cities, shanty slums, and dodgy bordellos of Second Life, Ed slammed down the top of the me-comp on Dr. Onis's hand. He heard the satisfying sound of breaking fingers. How could I miss, he thought, 12 fingers? Then in one swift gesture, Ed grabbed the musketoon and shoved it hard into the minister's gut. Dr. Onis gasped. Ed reached for the doctor's groin and applied the sailor's secret handshake, and Dr. Onis fell unconscious. Ed opened one of the little bottles of Uncle Ben's and poured the contents onto Dr. Onis. Lifting the dead weight of the bureaucrat, Ed stepped into the aisle. The pert stewardess, who had been lap dancing with a traveling salesman across the aisle, looked up. "Too much to drink," said Ed. "I warned him, but he said no. Well, now he'll have to learn. I'll have to take him to the laboratory," he droned on. With hardly a glance, the stewardess refocused her attention on the stack of 10 linden notes held in the hand of the salesman. Dragging the body to the low-class cabin, Ed began singing sea shanties to distract the passengers from the dead weight of his companion. "What shall we do with a drunken sailor? What shall we do with a drunken sailor? What shall we do with a drunken sailor early in the morning?" As if on cue, a group of uniformed Marines and sailors, 3 sheets to the wind, and on their way back to Camp Paradise on Saints and Sinners Isle, immediately responded. "Hey ho, way ho, heave ho, and up she rises. Hey ho, weave ho, hey ho, and up she rises. Hey ho, weave ho, hey ho, and up she rises early in the morning." Ed continued, shifting to the key of G. "Put him in the head until he's sober, put him in the head until he's sober, put him in the head until he's sober early in the morning." The Marines and sailors burst out laughing and gave Ed a knowing nod. Ed dropped the unconscious body of Dr. Onis into the loo, checked his pulse, and emptied the final tiny bottle of Uncle Ben's onto the misbegotten comb-over. Dr. Onis was alive, but his head would really hurt in the morning. Uncle Ben's was caustic without branch water ice and a beer chaser. Closing the door, Ed reached into the shelf above the door and found the sign, "Out of Order." He placed the sign on the handle of the loo. He knew where the sign was. Everyone did. It was extraordinary that the laboratory ever worked on the morning blimp to the capital. Ed noticed a change in pitch coming from the steam engines powered by the blimp. They were making their approach to the Hanjian airport at the capital. Ed hurried back to his seat. It was almost noon.